Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about environmental destruction, the Great Depression, and American culture, especially during the Dust Bowl and also the flooding of the Mississippi Delta. This week you're going to read Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a very unusual story for a Great Depression class. The typical go-to would be Steinbeck. Both books are about environmental destruction, environmental catastrophes, family, love, perseverance. But Their Eyes Were Watching God tells that story from a different perspective, from an African-American queer female author, Zora Neale Hurston. The precursor for both this era of environmental destruction and also the blues era in the Great Depression really starts 2 years before the economic crash. The precursor was the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 that displaced 200,000 African Americans from the Delta. As bluesman Charlie Patton described the environmental catastrophe that upended life throughout the Delta in his blues song High Water Everywhere, he sang, "The water was rising up my friend's door. The man said his womenfolk, Lord, we better go." Blind Lemon Jefferson described the terrifying exile and cataclysmic destruction, wailing, "The backwater rising, come in my windows and door. I leave with a prayer in my heart, backwater won't rise no more." Bessie Smith summarized the mass exodus of African Americans succinctly when she sang, "Backwater blues done called me to pack up my things and go, 'cause my house fell down. I can't live there no more." So in our last lecture, we talked about jazz music, and jazz music was largely the Black cultural expression in urban districts, New Orleans, Harlem, and Paris, part of this Great Migration. But down south, it was about the blues. The blues was born of a slave past to sharecroppers in the 20th century who continued to live and work on the plantations of their forefathers. The blues spoke out of group experience and made the individual problems they stressed, dislocation, loneliness, broken families, economic difficulties, seem common and converted them into a shared experience. When Robert Palmer famously asked how much history can be transmitted by pressure on a guitar strings, the blues is what he was referencing. The blues was derived of field hollers, work songs, and of spirituals, of diddly sticks, banjo picking that ultimately turned into guitar work. As some say, the blues was not born in the church, it was born in the field. Drumming patterns echoed African and Caribbean drumming patterns, born of slave ships that echoed in remote cotton fields. Mississippi was the heart of it. The Delta is where this story starts, with blues legends like Charlie Patton, Son House, and Willie Brown, who were seen as the forefathers, really. They were competitive, they were showmen. They played their guitars behind their back, between their legs, above their head. They're the spiritual fathers to Muddy Waters and to Jimi Hendrix, who electrify a lot of these techniques. They teased and made fun of a young Robert Johnson, who famously disappeared for 1 year and returned to the Mississippi Delta as one of the greatest guitar players who ever lived. And famously, there is a myth that he claimed that he struck a bargain with the devil that he met at the crossroads of two highways to acquire his musical talent, speed, and agility. Johnny Shine said of Johnson's guitar playing, quote, "It seemed to talk, repeat and say words with him like no one else in the world could." There's a lot of symbolism in Robert Johnson's songs that speak to a more complex understanding of who or what the devil is beyond traditional Christian understandings. So Hellhounds on His Trail one generation removed from slavery in a family that experienced lynchings. There's a lot of hoodoo references and hoodoo insights. And so a lot of musicologists and historians have argued that these were ways through blues music to gain insight and control into a world that truly had very few options. Common themes included resisting temptation, gambling, indulging in liquor, women, sex, love lost, unemployment, living on public assistance, and the struggle overall during the Great Depression. Some of the most beloved stage performers and recording artists who were blues artists were actually women. Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, who toured on vaudeville and Chitlin circuits, who developed vocal stylings that allow for an Etta James, a Dinah Washington, and Aretha Franklin or a Whitney Houston. And white women who inherit their tradition might include Janis Joplin or Bonnie Raitt. Blues women were incredibly theatrical. They traveled with elaborate set designs, wore beaded gowns that cost a small fortune in the 1920s and 30s. They adorned themselves in feathered boas, Art Deco headbands, rhinestones, real jewels, and gloves, satin gloves. In the most basic musicological sense, there are some patterns that make blues distinct. They tend to be songs with a 12-bar chorus consisting of a 3-line stanza, with the second line repeating the first, the 1-4-5. Blues notes, changing the pitch, a walking bass line, glass guitar slides, the use of harmonicas for the call and the response. These were all staples of blues music. The blues were also a form of folklore, a form of oral history. They're a form of labor history. They're a bottom-up history. They tell a different story and a different interpretation of global and American events from the perspective of African Americans. The Delta is approximately 200 miles of low, flat plain running from Mississippi to Vicksburg, bound by the Mississippi River to the west and the Yazoo River to the east. Its topsoil is dark and deep and associated with being ideal for cotton. And of course, blues spread up from the Delta to places like Memphis, where rock and roll and Sun Studios reinterpret the rhythms, the lyrics, and song structures with amplified sound to usher in American music as you know it today. It was the Mississippi Delta itself that really was the crossroads. It was the crossroads for the touring tent shows, which flooded the area at harvest time and served as a locus of repertoire development and exchange among traveling entertainers and agricultural laborers. This confluence is why the Delta became the hub as people traveled up and down the rivers between New Orleans and Memphis. The genre was aided by juke joints, places where you could go to dance, gamble, and drink, to a live band, and also the advent of recorded music, making it portable. The Delta is a region that is incredibly rich in culture and rich in soil, but for the vast African American population, it was a place of the greatest poverty of the 20th century. Perhaps the only place in America more impoverished were, of course, the Native American reservations. And by World War II, we get a second generation, an urban blues generation, that moved into places like Chicago through the Great Migration that we've been talking about, electrifying the genre, including Muddy Waters, Little Walter, and Howling Wolf, on the Fordist genre of industrial sound known as Chicago blues, a hard-driving sonic analog to the migration narrative of the Deep South, laboring, recently come north. Chess Records became one of the major distributors. So below I'm going to include Robert Johnson's song, Crossroad Blues. And I really want to recommend that you check out a documentary. It's really short. It's only about 40 minutes, called Devil at the Crossroads on Netflix. And it does a great job of exploring these sort of slavery and Jim Crow echoes of what's going on in his lyrics, reconstituting Robert Johnson's life, which is so shrouded in myth. I'm also going to include Hard Time Killing for Blues by Skip James. And I want you to think about what this song is talking about in the context of the Great Depression. And I'm going to read the lyrics for you. Hard times is here and everywhere you go. Times are harder than ever been before. You know that people, they're a-driftin' from door to door. But you can't find no heaven. I don't care where they go. People, if I ever can get up off of this hard killin' floor, Lord, I'll never get down this low no more. When you hear me singing this old lonesome song, people, you know, these hard times can last us so long. You know, you say you had money. You better be sure. Lord, these hard times gonna kill you. Just drag on slow. The other song that I would ask you to listen to is Howling Wolf's Backdoor Man. So this represents the second generation, this urban electric generation. And it's fascinating for its layers. It evokes Jim Crow America in the title, so having to use this back door of an establishment or the realities of redlining. The song is disorienting from its first notes, and it completely stays that way. It's minimal, it's sinister, it's edgy. And I hope you listen to and pay attention to the riddles, the straightforward proclamation that I am immediately qualified. It drives headlong into the narrator's midnight sexual prowess. I will ask you to pay attention to the gender play, the Jim Crow authorities that are referenced, the doctor, the judge, the cop, the temporality of the song. There's all kinds of animal sound references throughout it, alongside human cries and machinery, gunshots, references to state violence, but also this domestic realm, sexuality, pleasure, pleasure of the soul, and freedom. And so it's a ton of information crammed into this very witty, interesting, and in some ways funny song that's only 2 minutes and 48 seconds long. And that's exactly what the blues does. They are deceptively simplistic. And I want to read some comments from Professor Eric Lott about this song. So he says that the sub-slavery levels of healthcare in the Mississippi Delta resulted in chronic throat and teeth infections, the musical yield on which was Howling Wolf's claim to fame. In the grain of his voice in this song, you can hear a whole social world. Psychologically, Wolf in adulthood exhibited classic symptoms of trauma survival, including wild swings between gentle solitude, paranoia, and violence. Backdoor Man may be said to contain all three. He appears to have actually killed a man with a hoe in Mississippi in an argument over a woman. And when he was later, at the ripe age of 30, forced into the army by plantation owners who resented his ability to circumvent farm labor by playing music, the regimented life of the military led to what he himself described as, quote, his nervous breakdown. He was honorably discharged in 1943. There is an even more pressingly violent agrarian to industrial transformation of rural southerner into urban northerner that was, as we've been talking about, experienced by millions of African Americans in these decades. A transformation fundamental to the very sound of a song like Black Door Man. So the instrumentation, how it's recorded, pay attention. And after the war, in 1948, Wolf migrated to West Memphis, where in 1951, he was to make his first records for Sam Phillips' Memphis recording service, and this is, of course, where Elvis Presley famously recorded his records. He then goes on to Chicago in 1952. And Eric Luck calls this transformation violent because the experience of urban shock in the context of a post-war manufacturing economy shot through the Jim Crow inequity deserves just that modifier. So when Robert Palmer once again observed, this world of Memphis gave us the first supermarket, the Piggly Wiggly, the first standardized motel chain, Holiday Inn, and the first white rock and roller star, Elvis Presley. And he wrote, "It was and is a vital, often violent, usually unpredictable city." And of course, the specter of James Earl Ray looms here, who assassinated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But at the same time, Memphis is central to the developments in popular music that took place during the 50s, where there was mostly a sudden burst of energy and flashes of intuition that help with the evolutionary development of what becomes global rock and roll. And of course, this music is a form of escape, of taking yourself out of this world and putting yourself in a new one. And escapism is really central to most Great Depression entertainment forms. So last week we talked about the radio, how the radio was a friend to people in this sort of traumatic economic downturn. And the other major thing that Americans flocked to is film. Going to the movies was incredibly cheap still in the 1930s and the 1940s, and families would go multiple times a week. And there's three main films that I want you to consider. These were all top-selling blockbusters. The first is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs by Walt Disney. That comes out in 1937, and this is the first full-length feature animated film. The second is The Wizard of Oz in 1939, starring Judy Garland with MGM. And the third is Gone with the Wind in 1939. So these are all major studio films of the Great Depression era. All three of these movies follow a lone woman and her cast of male characters in a moment of crisis, the Civil War, or being persecuted by evil witches through forests. All three have to figure out how to make their own way. They are films with very clear themes about industriousness, about persevering, about the benefits of collective work and collective labor. So here specifically, I would have you think about all of the mining songs and the collective house cleaning songs and scenes that are in Snow White, right? That we can get it done better together and we're off to work and it's a jolly good time. And of course, fantasy. These are hyper fantastical worlds that never existed, including Gone with the Wind. These are hyper productions with elaborate choreography, the lighting, the technicolor, very, very striking in all three films. They're also, in a lot of ways, reflections on the Great Depression and environmental catastrophe. So Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind is famously known as a lost cause hero of Civil War mythology. But at the core of the story, she's struggling to make her family farm work on her own after all the field hands and the slaves have left her. She's starving to death. And in both the final climatic scenes before intermission and the end of the film, she is bending over. She picks up dirt. She's thin. And she becomes the symbol of the American farm during the Dust Bowl, simultaneously land ownership and regrowth. And she yells, "As God is my witness, I will never go hungry again," in a moment when the majority of people in that theater were likely hungry. So she is a Dust Bowl symbol. She's a Great Depression symbol of strength, just as much as anything else. Dorothy, of course, is similarly displaced by an environmental catastrophe as well, the winds from a tornado that displace her from her farm in Kansas. And of course, that movie famously uses both black and white and then color to portray that transformation. All three of these films have a heroine who has to figure it out for herself, and that was in many ways reflective of what was happening in larger society, as most New Deal programs took men, both married and unattached men, and put them to work in other places in America, building roads, building dams, working as part of migratory labor. So women were on the home front alone, having to figure out the survival of their family, how to feed their children and how to feed their parents, the grandparents. And so when we read Their Eyes Were Watching God, I want you to think about Janie alongside these characters. Many readers today are sort of frustrated with the ending, and so I'm not going to tell you what happens, but I want you to put Janie alongside Scarlett O'Hara in the context of the self-resiliency that's needed to survive the Great Depression, and ask yourself if perhaps it's a profound statement of self-realization and self-contentment and self-knowing after world-shattering trauma. And part of why the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression were so jarring to the American psyche and so cataclysmic in American cultural forms is it upended the most central American myth, which is that mobilization, migration, physical movement, especially westward for white folks, would always lead to a better life, right? The American dream. We are all descended from immigrants, with the obvious two clear exceptions of African Americans who were kidnapped and stolen from Africa, or Native Americans. But everyone else is a descendant from an immigrant who decided to look for a better life and move to America, and then largely traveled westward from the East Coast. And so the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl does not bring economic success or comfort. When these migrants get to California, they don't find the promised land. They find more destitution. And perhaps no other image in American history in terms of the photographic archive resonates with the emotional urgency and tragic poignancy of this story than Dorothea Lange's somber portrait, Migrant Mother, which has achieved near mythical status, symbolizing, if not defining, an entire era in our nation's history. So Dorothea Lange, when she took the Migrant Mother, was working for the Farm Security Administration. So this is paid for by the WPA, the program that we talked about last week. The director of the New Deal's photography project said that, quote, "It was never surpassed to me. It was the picture. The others were marvelous, but there was something special." Writing in 1972, he recalled, "I still get that picture out and I look at it. I cannot account for that woman. So many times I've asked myself, what is she thinking? She has all of the suffering of mankind in her, but all the perseverance, too. You can see anything you want in her. She is immortal." This was the ultimate photo of the Great Migration to California, and Great Migration here means both white and black, during the 1930s, the result of the crisis in farming, the greatest crisis economically in the nation's history until, one could argue, this month, in 2020. The industrial expansion of the early century and the extraordinary demand of World War I had kept farm prices high, but following the war, demand collapsed and farm prices plummeted. Individual farmers responded to lower prices in the only way they knew how, by growing more in the hopes of increasing the revenue. Predictably, this drove the price of farm commodities further downward. By 1929, the average farm income had fallen 64% of its level 10 years before, and this was before the stock market crash and the technical onset of the Great Depression. When the nation's industrial economy went into a tailspin, agricultural markets literally collapsed. By 1932, farm income was a mere fifth of its post-war high. The New Deal shored up prices with government subsidies, but assisted large operations at the expense of small ones, and had the effect of tossing tenants and sharecroppers off their rented land, since landlords were being paid by the federal government to retire land from production. The agricultural crisis of the Great Depression was compounded by the extraordinary environmental crisis known as the Dust Bowl. The turmoil of farm bankruptcy and tenant eviction created another epic Western migration, but this time with pioneers traveling by automobile rather than covered wagon, as does the Joad family in the Grapes of Wrath. California seemed a new promised land, but instead of an agrarian dream, the family finds an industrial nightmare. Like the Joads, tens of thousands of, quote, Okies and Arkies, which were derogatory terms, found work as fruit or vegetable pickers. But even more joined the ever-increasing human flood into greater Los Angeles or other Western urban centers, the very place where these great American studio films are being made. The states of the Pacific receive 750,000 migrants in the 30s, primarily from the Plains states. This is part of why Dorothea Lange's photograph defined the look for the time. Her work is inspired by Steinbeck. Her work tracks these migrants, and she is a Californian, so she watched that transformation transpire. I now want to read for you just the first page of The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck, and I want you to think about what is being argued, what is the imagery, how does this compare or contrast to the other art forms that we're talking about. To the red country and part of the gray country of Oklahoma, the last rains came gently, and they did not cut the scarred earth. The plows crossed and recrossed the rivel marks. The last rains lifted the corn quickly and scattered weed colonies and grass along the sides of the roads, so that the gray country and the dark red country began to disappear under a green cover. In the last part of May, the sky grew pale, and the clouds that had hung in high puffs for so long in the spring were dissipated. The sun flared down on the growing corn day after day until a line of brown spread along the edge of each green bayonet. The clouds appeared and went away, and in a while, they did not try anymore. The weeds grew darker green to protect themselves, and they did not spread anymore. The surface of the earth crusted a thin, hard crust, and as the sky became pale, so the earth became pale, pink in the red country, now white in the gray country. In the water-cut gullies, the earth dusted down in dry little streams. Gophers and antlions started small avalanches. And as the sharp sun struck day after day, the leaves of the young corn became less stiff and erect. They bent in a curve at first, and then, as the central ribs of strength grew weak, each leaf tilted downward. Then it was June, and the sun shone more fiercely. The brown lines on the corn leaves widened and moved in on the central ribs. The weeds frayed and edged back toward their roots. The air was thin and the sky more pale, and every day the earth paled. So I want you to pay attention to how their eyes were watching God begins, how the Hollywood films like Gone with the Wind or The Wizard of Oz portray this moment. And one thing that you might notice is that Steinbeck's opening is completely devoid of all people. It's purely environmental. But let's go back to the Migrant Mother series. So Dorothea Lange, in this world, traveling with people like Steinbeck and the photographers that he relied on to write his stories, she takes these photographs on March 9th, 1936, at a pea pickers encampment in California, a little south of San Luis Obispo on Highway 101. So these are people who are already in California. She was returning from an assignment further south and hurrying home to Berkeley, California. She was by herself when she suddenly saw the sign for the camp. Lange later remembered, "It was the end of a cold, miserable winter. I had been traveling in the field alone for a month, photographing the migratory farm labor of California. The ways of life and the conditions of these people who serve and produce our great crops. It was raining. The camera bags were packed, and I had on the seat beside me in the car the results of my long trip. It was a time of relief. 65 miles an hour for 7 hours would get me home to my family that night, and my eyes were glued to the wet and gleaming highway that stretched out ahead. I felt freed, for I could lift my mind off my job and think of home. I was on my way and barely saw a crude sign with pointing arrow which flashed by me at the side of the road saying Pea Pickers Camp. I didn't want to stop, and didn't. Then, accompanied by the rhythmic hum of the windshield wipers, arose an inner argument. Dorothea, how about that camp back there? What is the situation back there? Are you going to go back? To turn back certainly is not necessary. Haven't you plenty of negatives already on the subject? Isn't this just one more of the same? Having well convinced myself for 20 miles that I could continue on, I did the opposite. Almost without realizing what I was doing, I made a U-turn on the empty highway. I went back those 20 miles and turned off the highway at the sign, Pea Pickers Camp. I was following an instinct, not reason. I drove into that wet and soggy camp and parked my car like a homing pigeon. She pulled into the camp and found this family right at the entrance. Florence Owens and her daughters. Her husband and sons had taken the car, which had broken down in town and needed to be fixed. They had been picking beets in the Imperial Valley and were headed north to Watsonville on 101, hoping to find work in the lettuce fields. She had placed herself right there at the entrance to the camp so her husband wouldn't miss them when he returned. She was anxious. They had almost no money. It was raining. The kids were hungry. The migrant mother is often held up as the epitome of white suffering in the Great Depression. But the Owens, in fact, were not white. And I want you to look at these images, the composition, the structure, what they have, the texture of the fabric, the buttons. What is this? Is this a tent? Is this the back of a lean-to against a car? Where are they? What are the boxes? What do you see? So Migrant Mother 1, she took the first photograph at or near her car door, Dorothea's car door, moments after arriving, taking in the entire scene. Migrant Mother 2. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I do remember she asked me no questions. I did not ask her name or her history. She simply told me her age, 32. And I want you to remember back to when I said that before the advent of oral contraceptives, in this era, women continue to have a birth every 1.5 to 2 years. So pay attention to how many children have already been referenced by the age of just 32. There was the oldest girl, Viola, and she poses with the rocker. All members of the family look towards the camera. Persons in the picture: Pete, age 14, Ruby, age 5. So Pete is 14, the mother is 32, pay attention. Standing in what's likely a tent. Catherine, age 4. Florence, age 32, seated on the box, holding Norma, age 1. Migrant Mother 3, Lang remembered that Florence told her that she and the children, quote, had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children were able to kill. Lang now moved in to focus on mother and baby. She was now in most familiar territory. Dorothea Lang, after all, was a portrait artist originally. In Migrant Mother 4, she called back the little girl Ruby, asked her to take off her bonnet and rest her head against her mother's shoulder. Migrant Mother 5, the 5th exposure. When Lang got back to Berkeley that evening, she developed the film. She and her husband Taylor, who was an economics professor at UC Berkeley, were so impressed, they sent this one to an editor friend, and it was published the next day on the front page of the San Francisco News. The headline read, "Ragged, hungry, broke. Harvest workers live in squalor." Lang said, "There she sat in that lean-to tent with her children huddled around her, and seemed to know that my pictures might help her, and so she helped me." Migrant Mother 6. In the 6th, Lang has regrouped the two girls around the mother and perhaps asked the mother to hold her right hand to her face. It's interesting to consider what exactly is powerful about this series. Is it the closest view, the background, once it's eliminated? Certainly this one is the best composed. Is it the positioning of the bodies? Is it the gesture? The undefinable something in the expression of Florence Owen's eyes and face? Lang also sent a print of this to the News, and it was published on March 11th above an editorial entitled, "What does the New Deal mean to this mother and her children?" March 11, 1936. There was an immediate outcry because of these two photographs. Calls went to Washington, and within a week, there were deliveries of food and provisions to the camp. But by that time, Florence Owens and her family had moved on. Migrant Mother was published in the September issue of Survey, along with Lang's photographs and a report by her husband, Paul Taylor. Lang eventually sold a few of these. The most she ever personally received was $150. Of course, now the original prints would go for millions, unquestionably. But of course, there's been pushback about the possible exploitation of these pictures. Florence Owens, of course, is one of the most aggressive people to speak out about the photograph about herself. So Florence Owens was indeed from Oklahoma, but she was from Indian country because she was Cherokee. Her family was Cherokee, and they had been displaced from tribal lands, not a white farm. With her husband and 2 small children, she had first come to California in 1926, before the Great Depression, where the couple found work as native migrant laborers. Her husband died of tuberculosis in 1931, and she eventually returned to Oklahoma. In 1935, she came back out with her extended family. By then, she had 7 children by 32. She had met another man, began traveling with him, and had another child with him, this baby in the photograph. And yet she's exemplary of these drought refugees. And it's interesting to think about how the African American story in the Great Depression is about environmental displacement because of wet environmental catastrophes, the hurricanes, the flooding. But in the Midwest, it's really the drought and the Dust Bowl, these dry catastrophes, but both obviously kill and displace thousands. Owen's own children were bothered by the photograph. One said, quote, "Mother was a woman who loved to enjoy life, who loved her children. She loved music. She loved to dance. When I look at that photo of Mother, it saddens me. That's not how I remember her." Contrary to the despairing immobility the image seems to embody, Thompson and Owens were active participants in farm labor struggles in the 1930s. She was actually an organizer. She was a labor leader, as one daughter put it. That's one of the reasons that she herself resented that photo. It didn't show her in that true light. But Lang herself was very candid about the fact that FSA photos were political photos. They were paid for by the federal government in a moment of crisis. Quote, "Everything is propaganda for what you believe in," end quote, she told an interviewer shortly before her death. I don't see that it could be otherwise. I don't know. I've never been able to come to the conclusion that that's necessarily a bad word. Her photographs were interventions in favor of change, and they created an image of a people in a crisis that was extremely persuasive for Americans. And that's true beyond the migrant mother. So Dorothea Lange takes some of the most famous photographs, for example, of Japanese American internment. Her photos are political. They're meant to move people. And it is that vision, in addition to the artistry, that has made them endure and be emblematic of this entire period. So we need to be as sophisticated in reading these images as were the people who made them. Dorothea Lange and her husband Paul Taylor were pursuing an agenda, as was John Steinbeck in writing Grapes of Wrath, as was, surprisingly, Walt Disney when he made Snow White, as was Zora Neale Hurston when she wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God. They tell slivers of the Great Depression story, just like the bluesmen and the blueswomen. Step back and think about what impression of this world they collectively leave us with.